They called her just the help and swung doors that way into her life. Creak, clack, the steady rhythm of men and trouble, and the town of Harlow's Bend kept its eyes turned to easier things. The wind crept across the prairie in a dry, patient way, and the saloon at the edge of town smelled of tobacco, coffee, and last night's whiskey. The lamplight pooled across the worn floorboards, and in that pool she moved like a shadow with a purpose. Her name was May Hollis, and she would sweep, pour, stitch, and answer, day after dusty day, keeping the stove lit and the cups full. She kept herself smaller than the stove. She kept herself smaller than the trouble. She did it because the work had a steady heartbeat and because steady was safer than asking for more. May had come to Harlow's Bend the way so many women did then, with a suitcase of careful things and a past that folded into itself like a tucked shirt. She'd been widowed in time that made her quiet, and the town's tongues had given her a label like a cheap brooch. She wore it with the same calm she wore her apron, because it fitted and because it saved her from worse things. Calloused hands told the true stories beneath the label. Her palms had lines like topography, and the skin around her nails was cracked from soap and elbow grease. Her eyes were kind-eyed but steady, and they kept secrets the way the stove kept heat. For use, not for bragging. Mornings in the saloon began with the kettle hissing on the iron. The back door squeaked like an old horse's joint, and the air tasted of burned coffee and flour dust. Men arrived with boots caked in mud and words already loosened, expecting plates and ease. The small-town shamer, Mrs. Tallow, who folded her hands and wrapped her criticisms in polite sentences, would enter when the write-ups and gossip needed a current. She was sharp-dressed in the manner of someone who kept other people's faults like a private collection. Her husband ran a law office, and her laugh had the practiced music of someone who thrived on being listened to. She'd find a corner seat and tilt her chin to the light, watching May work with the same precise attention that a hawk gives to a field mouse. Every so often, she would lift her voice and offer a correction in the way of whether, "Darlin, that skirt's seen better days," or, "May, you shouldn't be standing on that stool. What would your late husband have thought?" May would not reply. She measured her breaths. The silence of her hands bore shame like a steady ache. She learned to fold things so that when they came undone, they did not show everyone how they'd been held together. She swept sweeping into prayerless shapes, each stroke a small insistence that life could still be made to look whole. On a day when the prairie shimmered with heat and the horizon rolled like a promise half-remembered, the saloon door swung wide and a man on a weathered horse eased into town. He tied the animal to a post, his hat riding low over his eyes, and left a shadow where his horse had stood. He didn't walk with the swagger of a man who expected applause. He moved like someone who had carried the weight of other people's sins too long to be surprised by anything anymore. They called him Luke Marlowe when they said anything at all. Some called him the buried past cowboy, because there were rumors and half-tales about trains and nights when the moon smelled like gunpowder. He wore his history like a coat that had patches on the elbows. Necessary, familiar. His hands were rough but quiet. He had been a soldier, the talk went, or an outlaw, or an heir who'd given up much. No matter what the stories said, his face held the kind of lines that were read like prayers, closed, shaped, full of a private grief. He took off his gloves and sat at the bar where the lamplight cut across the wood as if to measure him. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said the first time he noticed May. The words were soft, and the woman who owned them, a man who had watched more than he spoke, said them as if to himself. It wasn't flattery. It was reckoning. The saloon stilled for a moment when he said it, because even the chairs recognized the truth in his voice. May kept working. She poured his coffee into a tin mug and set it down with a plate of bread. He watched the way she moved. Efficient, careful, with an economy of motion that meant her life had been made of fewer luxuries than needs. He watched her watch people without asking for anything in return. When someone called her just the help, he watched how she didn't snap back, how she kept her chin but didn't raise it. He liked watching things like that. They made him remember a steadiness he thought he'd lost. There was a small kindness May gave one bitter afternoon that no one noticed but the boy who slouched at the back of the saloon and burned his knuckles on whiskey and pride. He was 14 and thin as a rail, and he arrived with a mouth full of bad decisions and a hunger that a pie couldn't fix. Someone pushed him to the door, and May saw him sitting there like a bruise. She slid a piece of chicken across without fanfare, and the smell of it made him close his eyes. He hadn't expected the world to offer him anything warm. Others in the room barked small laughs. Mrs. Tallow sniffed and said half loud, so everyone could hear, "Looks like the house's charity project struck again." The boy kept eating. May said nothing, and the silence of her kindness fell like a soft hand on his shoulder. Luke watched that moment. It sat in him like a stone, and he held it to himself. From then on he noticed the small acts as if they were signals on a long map. He took his coffee in the same tin mug. He left a coin when he could. He started coming back, not out of need for warmth but because watching May seemed like an honest way to spend an hour. People will say that the line between pity and help is a thin one. In Harlow's Bend, that line was well-worn and full of intentions. May's acts never asked for notice. She washed clothes, mended collars, and bound the small wounds that were left in the wake of men who thought nothing of getting rowdy. There was a dignity in her work that made Luke's jaw loosen without apology. He'd known rough hands before, but these hands worked with the patience of someone who had chosen to make life smaller in order to hold it better. Then came the incident that made the town's current judge its most notable thing. The 4th of July passed like a dull sun, and heat had baked everything to the consistency of old leather. The saloon filled with a special sort of mistrust that comes with too much fire and too many drinks. A traveling gambler came through, eyes sharp with the kind of confidence only quick hands can buy. He began to taunt, the way such men taunt, about town morals and what proper women should and shouldn't do. He jeered at May, calling her names that felt designed to bruise. May kept cleaning the bar, steady, not meeting his words with more than the silence of her work. Her voice, when she finally used it, could have been easy or it could have been something else. She said, plain and quiet, "Sir, you can take your business elsewhere." There was no reason in the world he should have listened. He did. Mrs. Tallow raised herself in her chair, prim and offended. She had been feeding on the story of the saloon like a woman who dines on gossip. "How dare you?" she said, making her words into a public thing. "You have no right to speak like that in my town. People with your—" Her sentence was full of a kind of moral calculus that never did the math for mercy. May didn't move. Her hands were damp from washing a plate. They were red at the knuckles. Her silence that day held more than offense. It held everything she had not allowed herself to feel since the morning the train sank its teeth into her life and took the man she loved. For a stretch, the only thing that had answered her grief was work. Work did not ask and work did not lie. Luke watched the exchange like someone who had been waiting for lightning. He could have turned away. But the town had a habit of letting some people pile shame onto others until the uplifted voices felt weightless and the downcast wore shame like an old coat. He found his boot nudging forward before his brain had the courtesy to weigh it. He stood up. The saloon seemed to inhale. People felt something change at the knees. He crossed the room in a few slow strides and didn't raise his voice. He set his palm on the gambler's shoulder and said, "Lo, you don't trouble her again." The gambler's smirk wavered. "You got no business," he said, voice trying on bravado and finding it too tight. Luke's voice was a low thing, not loud, but it moved like the shadow of a storm. "Leave," he said. "Leave the room. Leave the town if you have to. But you don't trouble her." The gambler laughed as a reflex, a sound like a snapped rope. The room waited for the next move. Luke had that old quiet a man builds when he carries more than luck in life. He was not a very public hero, and he hadn't promised to be. He just opened his coat to let the room see the steadiness he wore. The gambler's pride struck like a hand at first, white and quick. Luke's forearm met it with an answer born of muscle and something gentler. The gambler toppled into his own shame and then out the door. Silence thrummed after. The men in the saloon exchanged glances that needed no deciphering. Their faces were calendars of good intentions and terrible examples. Mrs. Tallow collected herself by making sure other people's sense of decency was always louder than her own. "Now look at that, Luke," she said, as though she were reporting a sunset to a room that required her voice as weather. "What do you think you're doing, stepping in?" Luke's back was to the room. He did not answer with speech. He answered by setting the gambling man's hat on the bar and picking up his tin mug. He said to May, though not directly looking at her, "You all right?" Even the question was small, enormous. May's mouth twitched like someone remembering a laugh. Her voice was settled. "I am," she said. "Thank you." It was not gratitude for the taking of a man's pride. It was gratitude for the simple fact that he had offered, in a world that rarely offered. It was a kindness small as a button and huge as a promise. People in the room felt the coincidence of two solitary lives recognizing each other and missed it because it offered them no audience. That night, the world outside the saloon was the color of used coins and dust. The stars came out like pinpricks on a black hat, and Luke walked May out to the back door. They stood in the lamplight by a kettle that still hissed, and for a moment the wind shut up. There was a way the prairie says things only if someone listens. Luke wanted to speak the way he spoke when leading a horse through a storm. Steady, simple. "You shouldn't have had to take that," he said. May wrapped her hands around the tin mug as if the metal were a thing to be trusted. Esteemed against the chill. Her voice came low. "Some things don't fix themselves till someone shows up," she said. "It's been that way for a long time." He let those words sit beside his own. He didn't push. He had learned that a true kindness is often the quiet one. He watched the small lines around her mouth, how they were maps of the days she'd folded life into work. In that moment he felt some unnameable past loosen its grip like a knot finding the tug it needed. He stepped closer, not to ask but to offer a space. And when the heat of the kettle rose between them, their shadows became friends on the wooden porch. Months fell over Harlow's Bend like pages turning. The seasons did what they always did. They carried away the bright and left the honest. Luke and May found themselves in the same spaces more often. He would come in, take his usual stool, and not make his presence an event. Sometimes they only exchanged glances. Other times, they sat beneath the back porch where the night had the luxury of being quiet. He told no long tales. When he did say something, it was practical, like handing someone a rope with a loop already formed. One evening, a little girl came into the saloon with a scraped knee and a courage bigger than her age. Her mother had been ill, nose like a map, and the girl's shoes had holes like small moons. May bent to examine the knee and murmured little things that resembled prayer, pressing on the wound with firm fingers and steady breath. The child closed her eyes and didn't flinch. Luke watched this, and in his chest an old machinery of compassion started working after years of rust. Mrs. Tallow watched too and seized the moment to cluck about too much charity, as if giving someone a stitch were an act of public provocation. "You ought to be more careful about encouraging such people," she said, the word such full of implication. "They make it a habit." May's hands moved slower, tender in a way that could not be advertised. She finished the child's bandage and ruffled her hair with a woman's affection that had no price tag. The child looked up at May with the sort of worship a person discovers only when someone else stands being kind without asking for recognition. Luke had spent many nights sitting up with his hands on his knees, deciding what to do with his past. Sometimes the best plan was none, to live, to be as honest as the day allowed. He found himself admiring how May held people. Steady, plain-spoken, unassuming. He wanted to tell her this. But he was a man who had learned silence as armor. So he began instead to leave small things, a flour sack from his own stores, a tin of coffee, a length of copper wire at the door. These were not all of himself, but they were the measurements he could safely give. The town noticed. Men who had not given anything in years began to find themselves recounting how generous Luke Marlowe had become. They dubbed him reformed, as if that reduced his living kindness to entertainment. May saw him sometimes leave something at her back door and would look over her shoulder, finding nothing but a note with the simple word. For use, she kept the notes in a little box beside the stove like rare coins. They were modest offerings, not money to boast about, but things that let a woman run a small establishment with fewer worries. Comfort glows unevenly. It illuminates what is near and leaves the farther edges of a life in shadow. Still, small comforts give roots. May's nights began to feel less like tight packs and more like rooms with windows. She slept with doors slightly open, and the wind that came in smelled like dust and safety. Luke would sometimes find himself on the porch at dawn watching her silhouette under the thin light, admiring the way she braided her hair back like a habitual prayer. He thought of offering her more than crumbs of himself, but the past had taught him that promises are often stones that sink in water. Then the town's gossip found a new sport. There came to Harlow's Bend a preacher, a man who believed in loud righteousness and the particular joy of judging other people's closets. He began to preach about proper women and men who stray, and used his pulpit to stitch the town together with pity and sharpness. Mrs. Tallow suited up for the sermons like a woman going to ball. She took offense at everything and wrapped it in velvet. The preacher's sermons drew a crowd whose faces always looked like they were about to be measured. One Sunday, when the heat made the chapel smell like boiled starch, the preacher took it upon himself to speak of women who worked in places where men drank and sinned. He didn't name May. But the measure of any small town's cruelty is how quickly it takes general remarks and aims them. People at the edge of town thrived on the choreography of their moral superiority. They made a small game of it. After the service, the preacher moved to a shade near the well and declared loudly that some associations were dangerous. He hinted that the town needed cleanliness and better examples. Mrs. Tallow raised herself like a queen at court and clipped, "It's time someone gave the town an example." May passed by, hands full of a bundle of linens, and the preacher's words hung in the air like a storm-sour smell. The town hissed in agreement. Some people are good at cruelty. They can pronounce fate with a smile attached. They called her small, called her forgotten, called her just the help, in new shades and turns to terrify her. May didn't answer. She walked on, stacking her linens like a small front against the tide. Her shoulders were steady, but inside, something tightened like a fist of regret. She's the sort of woman who had already known what getting called names did, and she had set aside the desire to answer. Not out of weakness, but because she measured how much energy the river would take if she threw stones into it. She kept that energy in reserve. She kept it for the things that truly needed her. Mending, feeding, holding small hands steady. Not everyone could hold silence. There came a day when the preacher's words turned sharper still. He spoke of order, of women having place. He meant it in a way that made the men shift in their chairs. He had the brittle confidence of a man who is certain because he fears nothing real. Mrs. Tallow nodded and smiled so wide it made her face into a map of angles. Then something happened that the town had not counted on. A man from out on the edge of town, known for his loyalty to a cause named Harlow's Honor, began pressing his luck. It was a small thing at first. He knocked a pile of linens from a step. Women nearby clucked, amused. But it was real humiliation when he called her by a slur so thin with cruelty that it made the room taste bitter. May stood at the bottom of the step, hair loose from the braid she usually kept, and she did not let the fall of the linens be the thing that broke her. Her hands brushed fabric to floor. The town's laughter, which had been loud enough to become a sound itself, sent a thin wire of pain through her that tightened like breath caught. Luke was sitting by the saloon window when it happened. He saw the arc of Mitt's dropping linen, heard the little pop of laughter, felt the room's rhythm shift toward a cruelty he could smell. He had chosen silence a long time ago and had found that sometimes the quietest act could number more truth than 50 speeches. He rose like a tide and moved. When he reached the step, the man who'd knocked the linens smiled like a dog expecting scraps. "What's the matter? You ain't fit to be where you are," he said. It was the sort of sentence that had been honed to wound. Luke's hand was on the man's shoulder. He didn't shout. He didn't make a show. He put the man back his feet and said, quiet as a law, "You apologize." "Now." The man's face flushed. The room held itself like a string pulled tight. People were quick to see the spectacle of a new sort of mercy. Not an apology so much as an instruction. The man refused. His pride was thick as an old wagon tongue. He swung at Luke, and Luke moved him with the patience of someone who had handled worse. The two men met with the kind of noise that makes you realize bodies speak when mouths fail. It was rough, and the town listened like it was a slow thunder expanding across the valley. When it was over, the man left in a scatter of dust and dignity, and the saloon went back to its steady. For a while, the preacher declared, loud as weather, that men like Luke Marlowe must be watched. We can't let such desert ways into our town, he said. We keep a standard, but the secret was that people who had been wearing the standard as a way to make themselves feel bigger now found that a man who had once been a something else could make a different standard. Caught in their throats. May felt the day's heat cool in the back of her throat. She found her hands trembling as if from cold. Her eyes had an amber light that was not grief but something like alarm. She moved to the stove and set the kettle on, letting it hiss like an old friend. Luke did not speak. He stayed near the door. When May finally looked his way, she had that steady quiet that said she would survive. Thank you, she said, and the words were small but undeniable. His reply was slow. He wanted to say more. He had a list of promises the world had taught him to keep short. Instead, he said, "You're not alone in it as long as I'm around." The moment they shared was not dramatic in any grand gesture. It was a small intersection of two lives that had each been hardened into useful shapes, and for once, they overlapped. The town's machinery of shaming didn't stop. It is often a machine that feeds on continuity and sense of being right. Mrs. Tallow found new ways to make the story of May's worth into gossip that fattened her evenings. The preacher raised his voice. A petition was drawn up in some woman's neat hand to preserve town morals, and it went from house to house like a rumor that had been waiting to be born. May read the petition, called for rules and propriety. It suggested that a woman who ran a saloon kitchen should not be so near the bar that she might influence men. As if kindness could be influence. As if working and feeding were sins when placed outside a label. May folded the paper carefully and tucked it away. She kept things like soil in a garden. Turned, tended, and not explained to the world. She felt hurt, of course. She had a life that held small wars like rocks. Past grief, emptied out wedding rings. A quietness that sometimes felt like shame. She hadn't expected a town would keep producing reasons to label her. But she had work, and she had a bowl that she set out each morning to collect the bits that needed mending. She had a small box of old notes Luke left and a jar with no lid for the coins the boy in the corner dropped. She had the particular relief of someone who couldn't be glamored out of their worth. That did something to a person. It made them into an endurance that some days resembled joy. Deep down, Luke felt a need to do more than see and to act. He'd been building a life designed to stay beneath the radar. He had a past that tugged at him like a weathered horse sometimes springs at a gate's sound. He had been in front of men with guns and horses and had learned to speak with his actions. If you asked him about his past, he'd look at the ground, and you would see a man who had been through a war with his own self. He wanted to give May a thing of steadiness that wasn't a coin or a note. He wanted to give her a start at something with the shape of forever. So one dust-swirled afternoon, when the sun had baked the world to a thin enamel, he came to the saloon with a box under his arm. He set it down at the bar and allowed himself a small breath to see how she would react. He had been thinking about a simple thing. A cabin on a small piece of land not far from the river, with windows where light could come in and a stove that was his idea of honest luxury. It was not a palace. It was meant to be a promise. "When I was a boy," he said, voice low like a creek under ice, "my pa taught me to keep a place ready, said it's for someone you count on. If you ever want a steady roof and a hand that will come when you call, there's a cabin waiting." He didn't wrap the words in anything pretty. He put them on the bar like a mason laying the first stone. May looked at him the way someone looks at a thing that might be both truth and danger. "Luke," she said, and the name had years in it like the weight of a cured hide. She was not one for romanticizing. She had been married once and had loved in a way that broke her into pieces and rebuilt her into someone more careful. The offer frightened her because it suggested being visible in a new way. It frightened her because it made space for vulnerability. It also, quietly, made her chest unclench. She thought of the stove that wouldn't be shared by other people's drinks. of being able to shut her door at night and feel someone beside her who chose that quiet thing. She did not answer then. She put her hands into the hot water and let the heat remind her of the practicality of life. She wanted to be sure she wasn't taking solace for kindness. But Luke had been patient with giving what he could. He had arrived in the town like someone who had learned to plant small seeds and watch for their stubborn green. "I'm not asking you tonight," he said. "What I'm offering is a thing with boards and a roof. If you ever think you might want it, I'll have it kept."
No payments. No fuss.
Mrs. Tallow heard about it the next day and took it upon herself to declare that Luke had designs. The town needed a story, and this particular story had all the making of scandal because it dared to be a match not arranged by a committee of gossip. She tooted and flapped and called it impropriety to suggest a woman should take refuge with a man outside the sanctity of marriage. The preacher called for patience and prayer, which in that town meant judgment and pamphlets. May watched how other people's lives were always hungry for her to be the center of them. She kept the offer in the pocket of her apron like a coin she didn't spend. She spent days thinking and nights visiting the idea as a lantern might fit in a hand. Warming, useful. She wanted to know if she could ask for more than a tin mug and a kind word. She had been hiding her soft spots behind a starch of work for so long that the thought of letting someone know them seemed to promise a dangerous unraveling. But Luke had given his word more times than he had been expected to, and it had begun to mean something. At last, summer turned and the prairie smelled like cut hay. May accepted the cabin, not as a dramatic surrender but as a practical arrangement. A shared roof, an agreement between two people who had seen hard things and wanted the comfort of someone to say the days to. They painted the cabin with borrowed paint and set a row of jars by the windows for wildflowers. They bought a single rocking chair that fit into the porch just right. The first time they slept in the quiet house, the prairie made a small music that sounded like approval. May woke to Luke hammering a board into place by the stoop and smiled to find someone had learned to be patient and to keep promises. Time has a way of testing gentleness. Months later, when autumn left the grass with the stubble of a harvest, the preacher and Mrs. Tallow found a way to make the town's tangle feel like a moral victory. They brought charges, paper thin and loud, claiming that a woman who had been the saloon's help now had a cabin and must pay for her station. They called it scandal. Some people, hungry for drama, started rumors that May had been bought. The town's moral ledger opened and closed as it pleased. May did not answer. She went on mending shirts and breaking bread for people who came in cold. She was careful, not defensive, and sometimes shook in a way she could not explain, because the world's expectations had a way of digging into the bones. Luke kept his hands busy with wood and wire and the small things that keep a life upright. He made repairs at dawn and brought coffee to May like a man who took pride in small constancies. Yet the town's loudness did not stop. It grew teeth. The day their trial came was an odd weather sort of day. Clouds gathered in a slow way as if worried. People came to the courthouse to see the show, curious about the woman they'd known as just the help. The preacher stood like a sentry on a hill of righteousness. Mrs. Tallow walked in with her chin up as if she had brought the whole docket of morals to the courthouse on purpose. Luke and May entered together, not holding hands in some dramatic display but close enough that the air between them felt like a third presence. The prosecutor, a man practiced in the art of words, made his case with the same ease his hands used for paper. He spoke about town morals, propriety, and the idea that certain places carry reputations that should never be sullied. He said it with the grave air of a man who believes he saves the town by keeping it small. People in the crowd nodded because that is a comfortable thing to do. May's voice when she spoke was a low thing. She described the facts of her life without embellishment. She spoke of mornings and nights, of stitches and soups, of how work shaped a life and gave it purpose. She spoke of being called names and of how the small kindness of a man had changed her. She said simply, "I came here to be useful. I am still useful. I am not asking for pity. I'm asking for nothing but to be allowed to be myself." It was the sort of defense that does not court the gallows of the public's appetite but goes straight to the bone. When it was his turn, Luke spoke with a voice like a fence at dusk. Solid. Sure. He did not flail the town with his history. He didn't list redeeming deeds or make the saloon into a sermon. He placed his hand on May's shoulder, not for show, but to anchor something that had become steady in his chest. "She's done nothing shameful," he said. "She ran a kitchen. She fed people. She kept a roof over herself. She did not steal. She did not lie. For that, you want to put her under a measure? Have you measured your own hearts lately?" People in the courtroom shuffled. The preacher, in his righteousness, looked wounded as if the world had noticed some failure in his sermons. Mrs. Tallow took her hand to her throat as if something inside her had been named. The judge, a man more used to numbers than to neighbors' mischief, found himself listening. When the case was over, no judgment was necessary. The prosecutor left with his paper and his pride still as inflated. But the town's seam had been tampered with. Small towns have long memories that prefer their losses small and their indignations loud. In the days that followed, the voices that had been quick to shame began to quiet. It was not that the town learned a new moral. It was that someone had stood for the simplicity of kindness and kept it in place. People began to find other things to do than gossip. Luke and May's life settled into a collection of days that were ordinary and remarkable at once. They mended fences and broke bread and grew things in a small patch of earth behind the cabin. They learned how to sleep with another's breathing in the night and to make space for solitude even under a shared roof. They found joy in the small questions. Who would fetch water in a storm? Who would write the letter to a boy in town with a wounded pride? They learned that belonging is not an event but a long list of small mercies. There were tender evenings when the two of them would sit on the porch with a tin mug between them and watch the stars prick the dark. Luke kept things short. He did not need to speak at length to tell one another what mattered. May learned to let him in at a pace she chose. She taught him how to braid dough for rolls. He taught her how to sit quiet with someone else's past and not be afraid. One night, as the cicadas made their small dry music and the wind moved the grass like someone turning pages, Luke wrapped his arm around May. They had been married in a way that needed no certificate. In Harlow's Bend, they were married by work and shared cups and a cabin that reeked, in the best way, of oak and patience. He didn't need luck, gold, or glory, and he never had from the beginning. What he needed was a person whose presence made the world more bearable. He looked at May under the sky, his voice like a soft rope that pulled at the things that mattered. "Darlin," he said, and the word itself was a small heirloom he offered her. "I don't need luck, gold, or glory. Just you by my side." She turned to him and, for once, let the answer be more than the smallness of survival. She had lived much of her life creased like a map, and the lines had been folded into privacy. Now she let the fold open. Her chin lifted. "I reckon I don't need them either," she said. "I just need you and a good stove." The stars listened. They had seen many such promises and often found them small and fragile. But a truth spoken without adornment is a truth that lasts. It fits like a well-made shoe and carries the person who wears it. They sat there, the two of them, and watched the night breathe. The saloon at the edge of town sang low. The kettle on their stove chimed once when the water boiled. The world outside hummed like someone turning in their sleep. The town's sharper voices grew into the background like a storm heard afar. Loud but no longer able to strike directly at the pair whose quiet had become a place. People began to notice other things about Harlow's Bend. They began to see small acts of common decency in places that previously had been no-goes. A man mended his own fence when he might have waited for a neighbor's help. A woman took a meal to another without the excuse of a sermon. The town learned that one person's act of kindness could be contagious in the best possible way. It did not happen with trumpets and banners. It happened with the soft spread of steady light across a porch. It shaped the town's small moral life into something more about saving rather than condemning. Months turned, and the leaves of the tree by the cabin's door turned themselves into golden coins and drifted away. Winter came like a slow question. The world outside became a place of white breath and the small, faithful clink of coal in a box. They closed the shutters tight but kept the inner windows open. On long nights, they sat close to the stove and read letters from the boy who used to slouch in the saloon, letters full of two-syllable truths and newfound warranties about a better life because once someone had offered him a slice of chicken without insistence. One winter night, as the wind rolled like a living thing at the edges of the world, there was a knock at the cabin door. It was Mrs. Tallow, cheeks flushed, hair in uneasy disarray. She had come looking for something she didn't expect. Not to pry, but because she had run out of ways to be something other than herself. May opened the door as if to a stranger who had come borrowing a cup of sugar. Mrs. Tallow had the courage that sometimes comes from having nothing left to protect but pride. She spoke first, which in that town always meant she meant it. "May," she said, voice low like someone pulling a thread, "I have been wrong about you. I saw what I wanted to see. You have shown me kindness I did not understand. I don't know how to say it, except to say I'm sorry." May looked at her with the kind of softness that does not come easy to people who had been beaten by a town's petty standards. The silence that filled the cabin felt like the hush after rain. "Thank you," May said. "That means more to me than you can know." Mrs. Tallow's face softened like a map after someone erased a line. She came in, shook out her coat, and sat by the stove. She told them that the preacher was starting to look elsewhere for sin, and that the town was busying itself with other things. She confessed small things, like how she had measured herself by other people's faults. She told a story of loneliness so deep she had not known it existed until she noticed May's steady ways and felt ashamed that she had ignored them. May poured a cup of coffee and placed it in Mrs. Tallow's trembling hands. These were not gestures of triumph. They were acts of the ordinary kind that change people over years rather than nights. The woman who had been their loudest critic left with a small softness in her face. Sometimes the only way for a town to shift is for its loudest skeptic to find that the things she scorned were the true constants. From there, Mr. Tallow's bark softened, and the preacher found other congregations less inclined to live out loud in other people's shadow. Years gathered on them like dust on a shelf. Luke and May planted a clapboard garden behind the cabin and taught a boy to mend a fence and a girl to knead dough. The saloon transformed into a place where sometimes a pot of soup sat on an old stove and people passed by for no reason but to be warm for 10 minutes. The town's capacity for shame diminished by degrees, replaced by an understanding that love is less loud than steady. The story of May Hollis and Luke Marlowe spread not as rumor but as the quiet truth of the street. That sometimes what saves a town is not a speech or a vote but two people keeping a door open. If you sat in Harlow's Bend long enough, you could watch kindness do its patient work. It is not always dramatic. It is often the daily thing. A repaired collar, a note with a coin, a cabin kept ready for a friend. These are the small economics of community. There was a plain moral to it that the narrator would not dress in ribbons, because truth is usually a plain thing. If you saw yourself in May, someone who kept quiet and carried her shame like a hidden thing, remember that the world is not always hearing and not always kind. But people who stay quiet are not pliant. They are shaped by loss into something steady. They deserve fewer accusations and more hands to hold them when the storm comes. If you saw yourself in Luke, a man with a past and a low voice, know that being seen is a cure of its own. Not every man's redemption comes with a parade. Some come with a tin mug and a promise kept. There were nights when May would stand at the kitchen window and count the stars like old friends, and Luke would stand behind her and thread his hand through hers. They didn't say everything. They didn't need to. They had lived enough to know that silence is sometimes the most articulate language two people can share. Their house was a place where the world could knock and occasionally be let in. In time, their porch held more footsteps than the town could count. Footsteps of people who had come to leave behind small scraps of pride and pick up a new kind of living. And if you ever pass through Harlow's Bend, and some of you have, you might catch a glimpse of a cabin with paint a little sun-faded and jars lined up on the sill. You might see a pair of chairs on the porch and two people who have chosen, again and again, to keep each other company through the slowness of life. You will not see fireworks or the loud proclamations of some grand fate. You will see a life of steady things, a stove that knows how to boil, a garden that knows how to grow, a chair that fits too. You will see the kind of love that builds a town rather than breaks it. If her story hit you hard, if you saw yourself in the stoic cowgirl who kept her gaze low and her heart steady, Don't forget the ones who stay quiet. Find them a chair. Share them a meal. Keep them phone calls that say nothing but the ordinary. You all right? We forget too often that soft voices need the same air as loud ones. Give them room. Let them be seen. She gave everything she had without asking, and finally someone gave back. Not fame. Not gold. Not fireworks. Just a roof, a hand to hold, and a life shared in the plain way that matters most. They didn't change the whole world, but they changed the part of it that matters to them. They built small things that became the town's backbone. Luke had been right from the beginning. He didn't need luck, gold, or glory. He needed someone who would stand by the window and count the stars, and someone who, on a cold night, would make the bed and tuck the covers like a small act of worship. May found that being loved quietly was a form of safety she had not been allowed before. They were not perfect. They argued about small things, about where to plant a pear tree, about whether to take on a stray dog. They were stubborn, each in their own ways, but their stubbornness kept them near. And that is the real miracle. Not that one's life becomes easier, but that two lives can be easy together in the sense that effort becomes mutual. Instead of carrying a life alone, they carried it two hands at a time. The town's small cruelties slowly edged out like shadows when the sun gets higher. People remembered what it took to stand simple and kind. So let this be the small and plain story to take with you when you next find pride sharpened and ready. Remember that the underdog is often the one who carries the most. Remember that a hand stretched without a demand will change more than 1,000 sermons. And remember that sometimes the greatest rescues are not dramatic. They are a man opening a cabin and a woman saying yes to the ordinary. They learned the truth of it in the night when the sky let its true faces show and the prairie made the lonely noise of a living thing. He said his line without fanfare, boots on the porch, hat at his knee. Darlin, I don't need luck, gold, or glory. Just you by my side, he said under the stars. She looked up, and for the first time in many years allowed herself a softness that was not weakness. She leaned into him. The stove in their cabin clicked and hissed like a small hymn. The prairie folded itself around them like a blanket. They did not say more. They did not need to. And that's how a whisper changed a town.